Well, religion's a funny thing, he said in a slightly more serious tone. I was only half kidding before when I made that comment about the Catholics. There are groups that practice mortification of the flesh as a way of disciplining themselves among the Catholic and even some Jewish Orthodox monks. I've read about the Opus Dei practitioners that will sometimes wear sharp chains around their legs or whip themselves as a form of self-mortification. I think they believe it purifies their spirit. That seems to be pretty much what we're seeing here, though this is obviously more brutal. That's fucked up, Tabby said behind him. Sure it is, Anton agreed without turning around. But that's true of a lot of religious practices. Look at what the church did during the witch trials in Salem. Well, witches are evil, right? Tabby asked. Anton turned this time. You're an idiot, he scolded her. It's ignorant people like you that cause most of this shit to happen in the first place. What? Are you a witch or something, Anton? Or a Satan worshipper? She asked him in a mocking tone. No, he said, going back to reading. I'm an atheist. I think even the noble religious practices get twisted into horrible things. And too many atrocities have been committed in the name of so-called God. If there really was a God, he would never let things like that happen. Religion makes people moral, she said. Without it, everyone would be out there doing whatever the fuck they wanted. Raping, murdering. He shook his head and chuckled under his breath. Steve stood, gripping the screwdriver he'd come looking for, suddenly sure that someone had entered the room behind him. He turned to face the figure in the doorway, but the darkness lent him no clues as to the newcomer's identity. Steve silently damned himself for not thinking to bring along a flashlight. "Who's there?" he called out to the stranger. The other did not answer, nor did it make a move to show itself. It simply stood motionless in the doorway, watching Steve intently. "Who is there?" he called again angrily. He held the screwdriver to himself like a weapon or a talisman, willing the other to show themselves. Still, it did not move. Cloaked carefully in the shadow of the doorway, its presence there mocked him. Like a footprint in snow, Steve's life would have gone completely unnoticed if not for the encounter he had in one of the science labs of the rebuilt Kettle Creek High School that morning. But like the spokes of a great wheel that lifts us up high and then crushes us beneath, tragedy was on its way back around again. Steve Murray was born in Jackson, New Jersey, to Morgan and Marie Murray, the youngest of 3 brothers. He spent most of his younger years in their combined shadow, neither as gifted nor intelligent as his older siblings in the eyes of his parents. He was passed over by his mother and took the brunt of his drunken, abusive father's violent attacks. Large for his age, when Steve reached high school, he turned to football and wrestling to take his mind off his tortured home life. Acting out in class at least won him friends. His father's violent nature manifested itself in him as he turned to bullying other children, and his size ensured he had few enemies. He married his high school sweetheart and moved to Chester right after high school. Largely estranged from the rest of his family, when his mother died in '83, he didn't even attend her funeral. With the birth of his daughter, Lynn Murray, Steve had finally found what he'd been missing his whole life, a family that he wanted. His wife and young daughter were the world to him. Then in 2007, tragedy found the Murrays. Lynn was struck and killed by a speeding motorist on her way to a friend's house in late October. She was 17. That same year, Sarah left Steve for a man she met on the internet after 27 years of marriage. Their relationship had never been able to heal from the shock of their daughter's death. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Steve had taken up another of his father's favorite pastimes, drinking heavily. Steve noted that it had been hours since his last drink. He wondered if that had anything to do with the shaking in his hand, or the phantom his mind told him that was standing in the doorway. He further noted that he sure could use one now. "If that's Anton or Rob, I swear I'm going to shove this screwdriver so far up your ass." Steve could feel his heart beating in his chest, flushing blood to every part of his body, throbbing in his toes and fingertips. His nerves were alive with electricity. He did not actually think that this was one of the men that he had come here with. He knew instinctively that this was someone else, and their intent here was malicious. He could feel the other's eyes on him, waiting for him to make a move. It stood in silent vigil, like a cat stalking a smaller animal that it intended to play with before eating. Though the room did not yet hold any school desks, being a science lab, it did contain a row of long, hard-topped islands with working gas burners. Steve slid slowly between the islands, keeping his eyes locked on the dark figure in the doorway. From his pocket, he produced a small disposable lighter. With a squeak of new valves, he tipped the chrome handle down to get the gas flowing. With a whoosh, he lit the gas stream, which plumed high into the air in a long jet of flame that lit the room in deep red. For an instant, the thing in the doorway was illuminated, but only for an instant. The man, if it was that, was huge. It wore some kind of mask over its face, long and black, elongated like the head of a great dog. The light reflected off the eye sockets, which were huge, empty rings filled with some kind of glass or shiny, clear plastic. A moment was all he had to see his opponent. As soon as the gas jet flared, the thing was on the move. It came towards Steve with unbelievable speed for something so big. The huge form crashed against him, its shoulder colliding with his broad chest and sending him sprawling backward onto the island behind him. He tipped back, sliding across the polished surface and toppling backwards. His head collided painfully with the table surface behind him. Tiny pinpricks of light flooded his vision. Steve could hear the other turn off the gas, and the room was once again plunged into complete darkness. He pushed himself backward into the corner, cowering like a frightened child. His hand went back to touch his aching head, and came back wet with blood. He wondered vaguely if he had sustained a concussion. The big man lay motionless on the floor for a long moment, waiting for the other to attack. But it seemed intent on playing with him first. Something so massive hardly had the need to hide itself, but it seemed content to do so just the same. Steve peered around the side of the island nearest him and could just make out the doorway. It was open. If he could just make it before the other could strike again, he would be free. He could warn the others. But he could not determine where the other was, or from which direction the attack would come. He slid himself into a frog crouch, ready to propel himself to his feet, but they would not move. Fear pinned him to the ground. "Go, damn it," he whispered to himself quietly. "Why won't you just go?" The last word escaped his mouth as a cry. He sprang forward like a runner leaving the starting block, but came up short as the great shadow detached itself from the greater dark and rose up before him. It was easily a foot taller than him. He instinctively lashed out at his opponent, drilling into its chest with a powerful right hook. It was like punching stone. The creature was shoved back several inches by the force, but hardly even seemed fazed by the blow. Steve made to run around his attacker and through the open door, but a powerful limb came up to block him, catching him heavily across the collarbone and flipping him onto his back again. Between having the wind knocked out of him and the darkness of the room, Steve found himself completely disoriented. He tried in vain to flip himself over onto his hands and knees, but the attacker was on him in a second, crashing against him again, sending him sprawling and sliding across the floor to smash jarringly into the wall below a large, square window. In the half-light of the storm-darkened sky that peeled in through the window, he saw his attacker again, for only an instant,